All right, good morning, everybody. We are in the final week. I don't see massive celebrations across the screens. I know this is a very busy time for all of you. Again, I know you've got a lot coming at you, winding up final weeks of lectures, assignments due, and then final exams next week. So what I want to do this morning is let's continue with water quality, and I should be able to get to the end of that. And then Thursday will be kind of closure where I try and tie a number of these themes together. Again, just a reminder, if you want to meet for a review or a chat or anything comes up, just send me an email. The way I like to do it, if possible, is for you to send me some times that work for you, and then I can slot you into my my calendar from there. I think that's just found that works better for me in terms of trying to get some time set aside. Anybody got any questions before we get going this morning? Any logistical issues?
How long is our final?
So the final is how they schedule it. Genera is all finals are scheduled within a much longer window. So it's scheduled from, I think, 11 till 1:30 or something like that. But it's a regular length exam, right? So the final will start at 11, and you'll have the normal. Even though it's a big window, it's not a cumulative exam. So the final is as long as the other exam. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The only reason I asked is because I was looking at the quiz section last night, and it says for the exam that it goes from 11 to 12:30 instead of 1:30.
Yeah, because it's so what I've done is the way, and I'll send an email on this. So the way in which I do the final, I've given the final a little bit more time because there's just a few more questions, and that was because of the not finishing off chapter 6. So I try and set one. I normally give you 1 minute per question. So there's just a few more questions on this one, but I'll explain that in an email. Bottom line is you'll have plenty of time to do this final. Any other questions, everybody? All good. Okay. All right, so let's keep going. So just to wrap up the water quantity, we've been talking about water use. I just wanted to talk briefly here about a couple of environmental issues related to water use, and then we'll get on to water quality. So obviously from a water resource perspective, one of the big issues, right, is overuse. Is what happens when you start over pumping a well and you just simply are taking out more water than that particular well has, right? And so this is something that is known as drawdown in the environmental hydrologic literature. And what drawdown basically is when you put a well into an aquifer and you over pump it. So this dashed line here would be the original water table in an unconfined aquifer, right? And what happens if you put a well into that unconfined aquifer and you start pumping it? What happens as you start pumping it, the water table here starts drawing down to the bottom of that well, right? It draws down to the bottom of the well. It starts like that, and then as you start pumping and you keep pumping, the water table ends up doing this, right? It ends up being drawn down to the base of the well. And in 3 dimensions, we call that a cone of depression. And one way to think about it is, let's say you've got, let's say you've got one of those squishy memory foam mattresses, right? And you put out a whole bunch of Skittles, lay Skittles out all over that mattress, okay? If the top of that mattress is the water table, and you take your finger and you push down into the mattress, what happens to the Skittles? They all begin to roll down to the base of your finger, right? Where you're pushing down on the mattress. And that is what a cone of depression looks like, right? The mattress draws down to the base of your finger, and all those Skittles begin to run down and collect at where you've pushed down, where you're applying pressure. So imagine that your finger is the well and that's pumping water out. And the more you pump, i.e. the harder you push down, the further down those skittles begin to collect. I don't know if that's a helpful or a silly way of explaining it. But the reality is that when you start over pumping a well, right, when you start sucking water out of a well here like that, that water table can get drawn down and nearby wells can get stranded, right? The water table drops below that nearby well. And Texas has this really interesting water law with groundwater, and the water law is the largest pump wins, right? You can pump groundwater and it doesn't really matter if you strand your neighbors, which is obviously enormously problematic, right? So that is one of the big environmental issues with groundwater, is simply over pumping wells. Now, I wanted to just talk briefly at the end here with water resources about our most important aquifer, okay, in the United States. This is the aquifer that it's the reason why we have agriculture where we do. Yeah, we've got good soils here, but this aquifer that I'm showing over here, and I'll just do a quick outline of it, this is what is known as the High Plains aquifer, right? If you're from Nebraska or Kansas, you may have heard this being referred to as the Ogallala aquifer. That's just a name that refers to the underlying geology. So this is an aquifer that sits under 8 states here, okay? And it's called the High Plains. And there's the Northern High Plains, the Middle High Plains, and the Southern High Plains. That's not of critical importance. But if we just hone in here to Texas, right, and we look at the Panhandle here, the High Plains aquifer, right, all over here that I'm just highlighting, is the most significant aquifer in Texas. There's several. We've already talked about the Edwards aquifer here, and there's one sitting on the Gulf here. But this aquifer, the High Plains aquifer, is fundamentally critical to agriculture in the United States. And the scale that we're looking at here, everybody, is how thick that aquifer is, right? The thickness of saturation. So in Nebraska, for example, you can see the bullseye here. There are places where that aquifer is over 1,000 feet thick, right? So that's an enormously deep formation. And it's one of the reasons why Nebraska, if you think back to Thursday when we looked at the individual states, why Nebraska gets most of its water from groundwater, because it's got this remarkable resource sitting underneath it. Okay, now you can see in other parts, so just let's look at here at New Mexico and Texas, the aquifer here is, you know, in some parts it's a couple hundred feet thick, but in other parts it's less than 50 feet thick, right? This is the aquifer that sustains agriculture in the Panhandle of Texas and Western Oklahoma and Kansas. And this is the aquifer that we have chronically overpumped over the years, right? So the High Plains aquifer, again, this is what it looks like in blue, the whole outlier there. I need to update this picture. I have a better one than the Shutterstock one, okay? This aquifer waters about 30% of all our crops in the United States. But the downside is, and this is the environmental issue, is that by 2060, about 2/3 of that aquifer will be gone, right? So this is a current, pressing, and I think I would argue pretty catastrophic environmental issue that we're facing in the Southern High Plains. This is a map that I think shows up well in print form, and it's perhaps a little hard to read here, but let me point out what we're looking at here, and let me change the color into green, right? So this shows the whole of the High Plains aquifer. And what we're looking at here, if you just look at the scale here, everybody, anything in red, so the dark red's in the pink. Let's just talk about the dark red for the second. This shows how much the water level has declined, right, since the aquifer started being developed, right? Since agriculture really started taking off in really the post-World War II era. And there are some areas here, again, this is Texas, right? Here's another couple, this is one in Kansas, where that aquifer has declined by more than 150 feet, right? Here's the map on the right shows the same thing, but the scale here is expressed as a percentage, right? As a percentage of the change in the aquifer. So this red bullseye here that you're seeing, okay, just south of Amarillo or near Lubbock, is more than 50%, right? That's a greater than 50% decline in that aquifer in the last 65 to 70 years, okay? So the left-hand side is the total decline. The right-hand side is the percent change. Now, what this just simply means, everybody, is that we are chronically over pumping this aquifer right throughout the high plains in order to sustain these yields and to sustain agriculture. And that is not a sustainable thing in the long run. That is going to be enormously problematic to this part of the United States, if that makes sense to everybody, okay? And so agriculture is where it's at in terms of the High Plains aquifer, right? The Southern High Plains. Just one other thing I wanted to mention, the overpumping of groundwater, the overpumping of aquifer in coastal regions adds another layer of complexity. So this is what happens when you're pumping too much water out of aquifers in the coastal regions. So this is fresh water, okay? And then this is salty water. And that's exactly how it occurs, right? We talk about a lens of fresh water, okay? So we've got seawater here. This darker blue that I've drawn here is the mixture, right? We call that brackish water. That's the kind of mixture between salty water and fresh water. And what happens when you start over pumping from aquifers along coastal regions is that salty water, that brackish water, starts migrating up into the bottom end of those pumps. That's known as saltwater intrusion, and it's almost impossible to reverse, right? Once you start over pumping aquifers along coastal regions, they are essentially rendered useless. And this is a major problem in many of our coastal regions. On Thursday, someone, I can't remember who it was, so forgive me, someone raised an interesting question in the chat about virtual water. I don't want to spend any time on virtual water other than to mention our water use gets quote unquote hidden into everyday items, right? And we need to take this into account when we start thinking about food production and water use. So I'm just going to use beef, for example. Again, I'm not a vegetarian, so I'm not trying to preach to anybody here. But raising cows is very expensive. We've already made that point, right? It's expensive in terms of feed. And we estimate in the United States that it takes something like 4,000 gallons of water per kilogram of beef. And we don't have to read through this in detail. You can take a look at this in your own time, right? That animal consumes grain, right? That grain has to be grown, drinking water. That virtual water that gets incorporated into the product is enormously expensive for something like beef, right? And it's just something to bear in mind when we think about water use, about virtual or hidden water. So the final one then, my final comment here before we go on to water quality is, you know, one of the points I made earlier on Thursday when we started this section, okay? Again, we're very, very fortunate, right? I just need to walk outside my office. I fill this thing up. I've got clean, potable water. I don't really have to worry about E. coli or Bilharzia or anything nearby. That is not the case for the majority of the world's population, right? They spend a considerable amount of time trying to get access to clean, potable water from a water use perspective. Let me stop there and see if anybody has any questions or comments or thoughts before we start talking specifically about water quality. All good. All right, cool. Okay, so let's talk about water quality then. Again, this is a big topic and I'm going to be selective as to what we cover. But like pollution, when we talked about primary and secondary pollutants, this is the first key point I want you to understand, and that is when we talk about water quality, we do make a distinction between what we call point and non-point source pollution, right? So point source pollution is fairly straightforward. That's pollution that is coming out of a specific point or a specific location that we can monitor and measure. So this is sewage coming out of a pipe being discharged into a water body from a specific point. Non-point source pollution over here is more complicated, right? Non-point source pollution are a variety of pollutants coming from a variety of sources. So in this case, we're seeing runoff coming down an agricultural field, and that runoff is probably taking some pollutants, whether that pollutant is a nutrient like nitrogen, and we'll explain why that's a pollutant in just a little bit, or sediment or something else that's coming off those fields, or runoff that's coming from urban areas, or so on, right? So that is pollution that's coming from a wider more spatially distributed set of sources, more difficult to monitor and more difficult to control. So that's just the first point I wanted to make, point versus non-point source pollution, right? So what are some of the key pollutants? Well, let's just look at, I think, three or just two or three of the major culprits here in the United States and worldwide, but let's just keep a frame of reference here in the US. These are the main reasons why we have compromised water quality here in the US. One is sediment, right? Now, we've talked about that last week in terms of Chapter 9 and soil degradation. So when runoff and wind, but primarily runoff, moves sediment into our waterways and it clogs up reservoirs and streams, sediment is in and of itself a pollutant. And in fact, it's the #1 pollutant we face in the United States because it compromises water quality and it's extraordinarily expensive. So the federal government spends $1 billion a year just keeping our waterways open. And that's not the entire United States. That's just some of our major waterways like Chesapeake Bay and the Mississippi, right? That number is certainly higher than that. So sediment in and of itself is a pollutant. It comes from a variety of sources that we've talked about: soil erosion, right? Runoff from agricultural fields and rivers eroding. Just incidentally, mass movement, that term relates to landslides and slope failures getting sediment into our waterways. Again, we've talked about this a little bit already when it comes to soil erosion. But how does sediment compromise water quality? Well, here's the primary reason, right? I think you and I think all of us understand what a clean river looks like and why that's important, right? So a river that doesn't have much sediment in it, okay? One of the key reasons why it's clean is that sunlight can penetrate through that water quality, and photosynthesis, okay, is ramped up. Photosynthesis can operate essentially unhindered, right, when you have clean water. So you've got lots of little niches here, resting places, hiding places for fish and microorganisms, and the aquatic food web can operate more or less unhindered, okay? Down the bottom here, when you have a murky stream, and the term here is turbid, right? We talk about the turbidity of water. That's an optical measure, everybody, where it tells you how much light is penetrating through the water column. So here we've got a body of water that is turbid. Photosynthesis is dramatically compromised, right? So productivity declines, sediment begins to bury all of these niches and resting places, and the water quality is compromised as a result of sediment, right? So sediment remains our #1 issue here in the US, at least in terms of stream productivity, okay? Another major issue, less so in the United States. Sorry, was there a question, Chanira? No, maybe? Okay.
No, I'm good.
Okay. Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, I just saw your name light up and I didn't want to interrupt. Okay. Another issue, and I would say, less so in the United States and more so in the developing world, is untreated waste, right? Untreated sewage, right? So if you don't have water treatment facilities that can clean the water up. So untreated waste, organic waste, whether that's urine, feces, and a whole range of organic waste, that also dramatically compromises water quality. And one of the things it does is it significantly reduces DO, right? Dissolved oxygen. So let's just talk about that for a minute. So we know that water has a certain amount of oxygen that's dissolved in it, right? That's the oxygen that organisms and fish use to function, okay? So that is DO, dissolved oxygen. And a healthy stream has dissolved oxygen levels of something in the region of 6 to 8 parts per million of dissolved oxygen in that water body, okay? Folks, I think that's a fairly useful number just to remember, 6 to 8 parts per million. It's an indication of healthy water. This diagram here, I'm almost certain you'll get to see this next week again. So this diagram here shows you what happens to dissolved oxygen when you introduce untreated sewage or organic waste into the river. So let me explain what's going on here, right? First of all, let's just look upstream of this point source of pollution. So here is a pipe that is discharging untreated sewage into a water body, right? Upstream from that, let's assume the water is clean and it has high dissolved oxygen. Let's say it's got 8 parts per million of dissolved oxygen up here. The black line is the actual amount of dissolved oxygen in the stream. This red or pink dashed line at the bottom here, folks, is the BOD, the biochemical oxygen demand, right? So what is that? Does anybody know what biochemical oxygen demand is, incidentally? Anybody want to have a stab at what BOD is? And it's low in the clean part here. So BOD is the oxygen demand from the microorganisms, the bacteria that will decompose organic waste, right? The bacteria in the sediments that decompose untreated sewage, decompose organic waste. And the BOD is low here. Why? Because the water's clean, okay? In other words, the bacteria, the microorganisms sitting down here on the bottom are just chilled. They don't have much to do, right? If the water's clean. What happens when you introduce the untreated sewage, right? You dump untreated sewage, organic waste into this stream. The BOD goes up dramatically. In other words, the bacteria go, aha, I got food here, right? And I need to start decomposing or eating my way through this untreated sewage. So the biochemical oxygen demand goes up dramatically, right? In and around that region where the waste is introduced into the river, okay? And as the bacteria start working their way through that untreated sewage, in other words, as they start decomposing that organic waste, the dissolved oxygen starts going down, right? And as you move downstream, it takes a while for those microorganisms and the bacteria to fully work their way through that waste. So this is known as an oxygen sag, okay? As you move downstream, the oxygen gets depleted as those bacteria increasingly decompose the untreated waste or the sewage, right? And when you see oxygen levels down here at about 2 parts per million, that is where fish cannot survive. That's where you get fish kills, okay? At 2 to 3 parts per million, most fish cannot survive there, right? It becomes called a dead zone, a little mini dead zone. And I'll talk a little bit about dead zones in just a second, okay? Eventually, those bacteria begin to consume and completely decompose that untreated sewage. And so their biochemical oxygen demand begins to go down and the dissolved oxygen levels in the water begin to recover, right? To the point downstream where the water will become clean again and the BOD will be low, right? Does that make sense to everybody? This is how water in rivers is naturally cleaned up by bacteria in the sediments and the microorganisms that will themselves decompose the organic material. This is the tricky part here, right? The part in the middle here where the dissolved oxygen levels go down and where we get fish kills. All right, let me stop there, see if there are any questions on that.
Do you mind re-explaining the last part, how it gets clean again?
Yeah, absolutely, Keegan. So what happens is eventually that untreated sewage, right, that organic waste, let's just say the urine and the feces and all the other nasty stuff that's in there, eventually that gets consumed and decomposed by the bacteria, by the microorganism, okay? And so that gets taken out of the water column and the bacteria then don't need as much oxygen because they've cleaned up the river in a sense, right? They've run out of food. And so the biochemical oxygen demand goes down because they've worked their way through that organic waste and the dissolved oxygen levels recover in the stream. Does that make sense? So this is exactly what happens, everybody, in a wastewater treatment plant. Now, I know we haven't been able to go on normally when this is an in-person class, we actually take you all in lab to a wastewater treatment plant. This process is exactly what happens in a wastewater treatment plant, except we speed it up over a period of 12 to 18 hours and not what it would take in nature, which would probably be 2 to 3 weeks. So the water runs into a wastewater treatment plant and that water, first thing that happens is all the big stuff gets sifted out of it. And then that water goes through these huge tanks. You may have seen them, these big circular tanks, where they have, they pump in oxygen and they pump in the bacteria into that tank, and the bacteria then decompose the untreated organic waste in a wastewater treatment plant. And that's another major issue around the world, is untreated sewage and the depletion of oxygen in water columns. Okay. All right, here's another one. Here's another environmental issue. Anybody tell me what we're looking at here? Besides a golf course.
Eutrophication.
Say that again, Ben.
Eutrophication.
Okay, eutrophication. Yep,
Oh.
This is an example of eutrophication. All right, who wants to explain that? What's eutrophication? You've probably heard of it, right?
It's basically where nitrogen and phosphorus from things like agricultural runoff, they enter the water body and it contaminates it and it starts blocking sunlight.
Okay, good. Yeah, almost there. So Faith is right. It's a eutrophication is a degradation of water quality, right? Where we have things running off like nitrogen and phosphorus. And what it does, you're almost there, Faith. It doesn't block the sunlight. What happens is those nutrients that run off into the water body are food, right, for the algae. So the algae bloom. Okay, so what you see here is a mini algal bloom, right? The green algae in the pond here. And so those algae bloom because you've got excessive nutrients in this little pond here in this lake. And then what happens is the algae die and they sink to the bottom of the lake. And then the bacteria, the microorganisms, consume the algae, right? They decompose the algae, just like they did in the oxygen sag, except in this instance, it's not untreated sewage that's being dumped into the water. It's nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. So Faith, you're right. The same process holds true where we have nitrogen running into the water body here. The algae bloom. Okay, they don't block the sunlight. What they do is they bloom, then they die, and then they get decomposed, and that causes a degradation of water quality. So that's another aspect that I want to explore in just a second. Right. So as Esmeralda puts here in the chat, it's an excess of nutrients. Yeah. So, you know, this is potentially, I acknowledge here, this is potentially a misleading map, but what I wanted to show here is this shows, when you look at drainage basins in the United States, it shows what areas that our water is significantly compromised. So the Environmental Protection Agency calls this impairment, right? So if a water body is impaired, so every water body here in the US, folks, has a specific use, right? If it's a lake and it's just used for fishing and swimming, it needs to reach a certain level. If it's a reservoir that's used as drinking water, it needs to be at a different level, right? It needs to be cleaner, and we don't need to worry about exactly what those levels are. Now, I'm not here to imply that Mississippi is one big dead zone, right? All this is showing you is that the water bodies that are flowing through a state like Mississippi, look at the scale, 10 to 25% of that water is compromised, right? It's dramatically compromised. And all I'm suggesting, all that this map is suggesting, is that we have many parts of the United States. We tend not to think of water quality perhaps being such an issue here in the US, but it is, right? It is, largely because of runoff from agricultural fields. Okay. Now, I introduced you to the carbon cycle as the key cycle when we talked about climate change. This is the nitrogen cycle, right? So I want to just slow down here a little bit and spend a minute talking about the nitrogen cycle. Again, this is another one that you'll probably see next week, everybody. So let me explain what's going on with it. So why do we look at the nitrogen cycle? So we're going to talk about nitrogen here for a minute because nitrogen is a key essential nutrient for vegetation, right? When we want to increase our crop yields, or when we want, and I'm a terrible, I don't even have pot plants because I'm a useless green thumb, but if you want to increase the greenery in your apartment, right, what's one of the things you want to get? You want to get soil that is rich in nitrogen. It's an essential nutrient for plant growth. And we're going to talk briefly here about the nitrogen cycle because it is the key cycle when it comes to the degradation of water quality, when it comes to water pollution around the world, okay? So that's why we're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle. All right, let's go. Here's the key points about the nitrogen cycle. First off, remember that nitrogen is the dominant gas in the atmosphere, okay? Can anybody remember what percentage of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen?
70 no, that's wrong. I'm so sorry.
70, keep going, Holly, 70.
8.
There you go, 78, right? Ish. So 78% of the air outside is made up of nitrogen, N2, a nitrogen gas, right? That's useless for plants, okay? The plants don't get their nitrogen by their leaves just simply wafting in the wind and trapping nitrogen gas. That's not how it works. Something has to go on, and it's a really interesting and elegant cycle here on how plants get nitrogen. So anything in blue here is natural, okay? Anything in yellow is human. Anything in green is pollution, problems, and anything in red is plants taking something up. So this is my attempt to try and simplify the nitrogen cycle. So step one in the nitrogen cycle, right? N2 gas is converted into NH4 plus. And this is a simplification, but it's where we need to be, I think. N2 gas is converted by bacteria in the soil and bacteria in the root nodules of certain plants like legumes. And that nitrogen gas is converted into NH4 plus. Anybody remember what NH4 plus is from your chemistry? NH4 plus is?
Ammonia.
Yeah, ammonium, right?
Or ammonium.
NH4 plus is ammonium. Yep, good, Gavin, right? That's the first key point. That process is called mineralization, right? And the bacteria will also take some of the waste products that you can see here, the lovely stuff, urine and feces, and convert it ultimately into ammonia. So that is the key first step here in the nitrogen cycle, the conversion of nitrogen gas into ammonia, right? Point number one. Then what happens is there are a series of bacteria in the soil that convert the ammonium first into NO2 minus, which is nitrite, and that's toxic, okay? That's a slow process where the bacteria convert the ammonium into nitrite, and then a second set of bacteria convert that nitrite quickly, thankfully, into nitrate. And this is the key part of the nitrogen cycle, the NO3 minus, the nitrate, right? So again, bacteria convert N2 gas into ammonium through mineralization, and then through a second suite of processes or bacteria, and that set of processes we collectively called nitrification. It's the nitrification of ammonium. Goes first into nitrite, which is toxic to humans and the environment. And fortunately, that gets converted quickly into nitrate, NO3 minus. Nitrate, this over here, there's a good and bad, right? The good is that it is highly soluble in water, and that's the form that plants can easily take nitrogen into their systems. That's the primary pathway that crops will get nitrogen into the system, okay? So nitrate is highly mobile in water and plants can get at it. The bad news is nitrate is highly mobile in water. And if we put too much nitrogen on the fields, that nitrate will either leach out, run off into groundwater, or can run off into our lakes, reservoirs, and streams. And that's what causes the eutrophication, right? So we have a crop here, and we put too much fertilizer on it. That excess nitrogen in the form of nitrate can run off, whether it's a golf course or a crop, and that's what causes the algal bloom or the eutrophication. Okay, so again, it's nitrogen gas getting converted into ammonium and then into the soluble form of nitrate that plants can get at, but it can also get into the environment causing eutrophication, right? We also then as humans come along and do this, right? We come along and say, okay, we want to increase our crop yields. So we add nitrogen fertilizer to our fields to increase yields, right? That fertilizer can take various forms, okay? We can add ammonia, NH3, that then gets converted into ammonium and goes through the nitrification process and gets to nitrate, right? If that makes sense, right? So that's one type of fertilizer. NH3 gets converted into NH4 and then ultimately into nitrate. We can also add this. Does anybody know what this is? NH4NO3. That's tricky stuff. Be careful of Googling NH4NO3. Anybody know what that's called? Well, NH4 is ammonium and NO3 is nitrate. It's ammonium nitrate. Anybody heard of that?
Is it dissolving, like very, very dissolving, like
Yeah.
of anything pretty much?
Yeah, good, Courtney. It's highly soluble, right? So ammonium, you can apply ammonium nitrate to a field. It's in a white crystal form. It's highly soluble and it gets into the nitrate form very quickly, right? But it's tricky. Why is ammonium nitrate tricky? Well, we had a tragedy in Beirut. Remember that? We had a tragedy in West, just down the road here
Yeah,
a
it's
few
just
years
highly
ago.
explosive.
It's explosive, yeah, Gavin, it's explosive. If it's not stored correctly, it can be volatile, right? Ammonium nitrate is used in explosive. That's why it's probably not wise to Google it. The feds will be knocking on your door saying, Ollie, what's going on here? Why are you Googling ammonium nitrate? Okay, but it is it's very well managed and it's highly regulated by the community, by the EPA and the government. But it's used as a fertilizer, and as Courtney said, it's very soluble, so it can get into plants, right? And then that nitrate can also go back into the atmosphere through a process called denitrification. We're not going to worry too much about that, right? So that's the nitrogen cycle. So again, just very quickly, the key points here is nitrogen gas gets converted into nitrate and that's soluble and can get into plants. Ammonia and ammonium nitrate, fertilizers that can get into plants, okay? But if they're not managed well, we have an excess of nutrients and that nitrogen can then run off and start causing eutrophication, right? And you see that here. So this is the amount of nitrogen carried by the Mississippi, okay? And it's just to simply make the point that we have a steady increase up through to about the early 1990s. And yeah, there's variability, but we've got a lot of nitrogen that comes down the Mississippi, right? That's excess nitrogen that's running off from our agricultural fields. Here you can see the Mississippi Basin. Of course, this is where the mollisols are. This is where agriculture is, right? This is the Corn Belt. And when we over-fertilize our fields with nitrogen, that nitrogen ends off running down the Mississippi and can get into the Gulf of Mexico, right? And so this is kind of the closing environmental issue that I just wanted to talk about. Why do we look at this region? This is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. You've probably heard of the dead zone, right? In the Gulf of Mexico. Anybody want to talk for 15 seconds about what the dead zone is? How that happens? Here's the Mississippi here, it comes down here, here's New Orleans. And this here is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, right? This is an area where, just look at the scale here, everybody. Anything in orange, that longhorn UT orange, or less, is less than 3 parts per million, right? Remember, healthy water, 8 parts per million. Anything less than 2 to 3 parts per million is a dead zone. So what's going on here? This is all excess nitrogen. It flows down the Mississippi. It gets into the Gulf of Mexico. It causes the algal blooms. So it's eutrophication on a grand scale. This isn't a pond sitting next to a golf course. This is a very large pond in the ocean, right, on a grand scale. And those algal blooms, that algae then dies, the bacteria consume it, and the oxygen disappears, right? We get the dead zone. It's also called hypoxia, right? A hypoxic zone. Hypoxia is the technical term for a chronic depletion of dissolved oxygen. So this is a really interesting, if you're interested, I can send you web links on who manages this. It's monitored out of Louisiana State and Texas A&M, and they are responsible for measuring and monitoring the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And this shows the scale of the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico since the 1980s, right? It's grown since the 1970s, and it's now pretty much leveled off. Some years it's big, some years it's small, just depending on the climate and the rainfall and how much nitrogen, but it's averaging a size of about 15,000 square kilometers, right? It's an enormous region, and it dramatically impacts the shrimping and the fishing industry. This just shows the scale of that, that dead zone here when you look at the entire Mississippi basin, right? So anything in green is agricultural fields shedding nitrogen, and here's the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And there are many of these dead zones around the world, right? This one just happens to be on our doorstep. Okay, so let me just wrap this up on water quality, everybody. So we call it the water crisis. Again, we've looked at water quality and we've looked at water quantity. I know I've been very US centric, so let me end with a couple of maps here. This one here is a general map showing the percentage of the world's population with access to safe water, right? So anything in blue, more than 90% of the world's population has access to safe water. You can see as how those colors change. Some countries are less than 50%, right? Many parts of Africa and some parts of Southeast Asia, less than half the population has access to safe water, okay? That, in my opinion, and that's just my opinion, and I think there are some that would agree, is a gross violation of our human rights. That's just, you know, my 2 cents. I mean, it is, to me, a basic human right that we should have access to clean and safe water. And the tragedy is that a number of people on this planet do not have that, right? This one here shows the percentage of total disease burden caused by unsafe water by country, right? So anything in red here is somewhere in the region of 4 to 7. We could probably safely round that up to somewhere in the region of about 10%. 10%, what this says is anything in red, 10% of the disease burden, in other words, the impact on human health, can be attributed to unsafe water, right? And when we think of where the world's population is growing, again, that is a potential catastrophe that we're facing, I think, down the line. And I just have a sunset slide, pretty landscape from Vermont. All right, let me stop there, everyone. Questions, comments about water quality?
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
So a few years ago, I think it was like a year or two ago, like South Africa was like running out of water.
Yeah.
What happened with that? I mean, obviously, I think they have water now. I mean, what was the deal with that?
Yeah, day 0, right?
Yeah, that's what I remember.
It was so yeah, I was very interested in that for obvious reasons, right? My mom lives in Cape Town, and so I was getting WhatsApp messages every week from her giving me an update, a blow-by-blow update. And so what happened there, unfortunately, not enough money has been spent on the infrastructure in a place like Cape Town, Kevin, and they rely on one reservoir for their drinking water. And you go through a 2 to 3 year drought, and there's no way to get water into that reservoir, and the supply is dramatically compromised. So that's essentially what happened there, right? There is one major reservoir for Cape Town. They now have decided maybe it would be a good idea to put a secondary reservoir in, which is what they're doing. So yeah, it was one reservoir that got very, very low. The climate near the Cape, and certainly as you move inland from the Cape, starts getting dry pretty quickly. It's a very sensitive and vulnerable part of the world where you can get extreme and extended droughts. And so that's what happened with Cape Town. And my mom was on significant rations for about 6 months, you know, showering every third day, bottled water, like that. So yeah, that's what happened there. Glad you raised it. Anything else? I don't know about you folks, but when we went through Snowvid 3 months ago, you know, I live in Montgomery Plaza on West 7th Street, and so we lost power. We lost and we lost our water. We lost heat, and we lost water. And you take it for granted, and until, you know, day 4 comes along, and you can't turn the faucet on, and you go, well, this is no fun, right? And so it makes you realize how lucky and fortunate we are to have access to water. Any other questions or comments or thoughts? All good. All right, young environmentalists. So we have one more visit, the visit on Tuesday. I have put up the study guide, right? Same as last time. I've put there, these are the things that I expect you to know, the key diagrams. So please take a look at that. And I will have time on Thursday to talk a little bit more about the exam and about the study guide. The structure is going to be exactly the same. There'll be some short answers and some fill-ins towards the end of that. But we'll tackle that on Thursday. And as always, I will hang around and see if there are any questions. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
You got it.
Hi, Dr.